I think being an artist is about taking risks. And if you're willing to push the boundaries in whatever way you can, whether it be, about the commodification of your work or the materiality of your work, whatever it is, the ideas, I think that's what makes it exciting and interesting, right?
Welcome. I'm Doug Kacena. I'm an artist, a gallerist, a curator, and a collector. And this is Artbound, where we deconstruct the myths and misconceptions of the art world. We have the conversations here with artists that aren't going to be found anywhere else. Well, thank you guys for joining us. In this episode, we're going to go after one of the really big questions. And I'm not sure that we're even going to scratch the surface on this one. And I'm hoping we go in like a million different directions. We're going to be talking about what exactly art is. Primarily more about object and what is art as the object. I have two amazing guests that are going to be joining me today. First, I have Suchitra Mattai, who is joining us from her studio in Denver, Colorado. Hi, Suchitra.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And then I also have from Richmond, Virginia, joining us from his studio there is Taylor White. Hi, Taylor.
Hey, Doug. How are you? Thanks for having me on. I'm super stoked to be on your podcast.
Well, thanks for joining us. Like I said, this is going to be a really kind of deep dive question, and hopefully we kind of skip off the surface of it a little bit. But before we get going into it, I want to give people a little background about why I think you guys are both so amazing to dive into this topic. So first off, Taylor's art practice is there's a really big sense of humor with his work. And both of these artists really have a fearless approach to media. Taylor, amongst his many accolades, he has galleries in Asia, in Australia, in Europe, in New York. He's kind of if you look at his CV, I think he's shown everywhere last year. And upcoming, he has an exhibition in Shanghai and Chicago with art fairs that are opening probably this weekend. He uses construction materials and paint and Post-it notes and found objects and a little bit of everything. Kind of, if you can put it on a surface, I think he's probably used it. And then Suchitra Mattai is also incredibly fearless with her approach to media. She uses a lot of fiber-based media, found object, video, in really kind of an installation-based way. Recently, she's shown with the Sharjah Biannual in the United Arab Emirates, where she converted an enormous courtyard into one large installation piece. We just placed a big 15 by 40 foot piece in the permanent collection of crystal bridges for her, which she was just part of the Art of the State show there, and really is doing some interesting exhibitions inside and outside of the museum system. I think I alluded a little bit to Taylor's sense of humor, which, kind of weaves its way into most of his art practice. I think everybody needs to go to Taylor's Instagram and check out this video of him in tidy whities and a lawnmower. I think it's absolutely hilarious, and it really kind of drives home the point of, that art can exist in so many different ways, and there's so many different entry points in which we engage with art. And I think humor is such a relevant way as far as how do we lead the conversation into something a little more serious. So Taylor, what is kind of the strangest material that you've ever used in your art practice?
I don't know. Probably the lawnmower itself, like a whole lawnmower instead of some textile material or something. But yeah, I would say that, the object, the actual functioning lawnmower as a component of a work. It's you have the performer, you have the stage that I built and all that, and the fake grass that I painted on it and stuff. And then here's a real lawnmower. And so, yeah, that's probably the most interesting piece of material that I've used in a painting. The other things I use are not necessarily like new to art materials. They're like it's canvas and plywood and cardboard and all these types of like kind of different textile materials and things like that. Well, right now I'm doing some stuff with lottery tickets. I've got hundreds of losing lottery tickets, and I'm making a giant painting out of sewn together lottery tickets. But
I'll send you a couple.
Yeah, I've got a bunch. I learned about them when I was researching them, and I was like, why are these so expensive on eBay? Like, aren't these garbage? And people that gamble can write off lottery ticket losses. So there's a market for these. So anyway, I started buying like losing lottery tickets as art material.
Then we're already starting to get into that realm of, there's artists who've used, currency in their artwork. And, there's some legal ramifications to that, apparently. Not that I think that anybody's ever going to like come up to an artist and be like, you can't glue that money onto your surface there.
You're taking that out of circulation and reducing whatever. Whatever.
Well, and Suchitra, a lot of your practice comes from going to thrift stores, I feel like, and finding objects to engage with that you later then kind of elevate to this art with a capital A in your recontextualization of the object. What is one of the most interesting things that you found that you really weren't expecting and that ended up in one of your pieces?
I would probably say the merry-go-round, using a whole merry-go-round and then activating it to actually circulate. I think that was probably the most interesting object. I do use a lot of found furniture, dressers and chairs and other objects that I then change the meaning for. But I think the merry-go-round was probably the largest, heaviest, and most bizarre object I've used.
So
super cool,
just to kind of describe it to our listeners, this was in an installation piece in Sharjah, in the desert, in a courtyard, where she had vintage woven saris as this canopy that stretched from the kind of rooftops into this courtyard, enveloping parts of it, and had this curved video screen with border imagery projected onto it, and then a full moving merry-go-round in front of it, just kind of automated and moving the whole time. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy, man.
So lawnmowers and merry-go-rounds. This is a good start to like, how do we talk about art? How do we talk about the object? And first of all, I can't believe that we're still kind of having this conversation. So, we look at kind of the Duchamp urinal, from 100 years ago, and what a shock that was, that a found object can be recontextualized into artwork, but then let's go back 3,000 years ago and look at, like the Woman of Willendorf or like stacked rocks or, kind of all of these things that have been practiced. I feel like the very first iteration of art in its purest form was probably a found object, and looking at that object and recontextualizing it in some way and saying, okay, how do I look at the world through this? Here we are 100 years post Duchamp, and we're still kind of wrapping our heads around it, because I think so many people really are so enamored with this idea of painting, of, kind of this hierarchy of materials sometimes. And, like the general population has really kind of bought into that idea of it. So how do we start talking about what art is through this idea of object? Where are you guys landing on this? Does this, like, I don't know if there was a question in there, but like, what does object mean to the art practice, and where does it kind of fall into your individual practice?
I would say that the context that the thing that you're using, the object, is sometimes what kind of turns that thing into art, at least in my estimation. Like I can go to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger and just set it on a table and in the right environment and like, look at this, it's art. Like that's what made me really want to be an artist, is when I came to art like late in life. I wasn't even interested in art until I was 35. I was in college. I was fascinated with like how subjective everything was, and there was no structure. Even the entire industry that supports it is completely like hilariously unregulated. And I was like, man, this is like a free for all. Like, I can just set this, I can set this like box cutter on the table and be like, look at this, check this out.
Banana with duct tape and three editions.
Yeah. I mean, that's like the hit of what show was that? Art Basel, Maurizio Catalan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's less about the thing that you're using, about what things are allowed to be art, and more about the context that it's placed in my opinion.
So and I totally agree about that. And I feel like it really is this idea of it being named as art.
Yeah.
Because
right.
as soon as somebody kind of tells you, okay, why is this art? As soon as they're questioning that, then it's like they've already proven that it is art, because they're having a conversation within the context of what art is to begin with. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think that's so hard for people to kind of wrap their head around, because I think there's this implied understanding that a piece of art is this object itself. It's not the concept, it's not the conversation, it's not the idea, that it only exists within the object. And really, who was it? I heard this phrase the other day that it was talking about stop looking at art as an object and start looking at it as a trigger for an experience. And I kind of loved that idea around, okay, so what is art then? Is it that object, or is it the experience that you were just triggered into?
Sure.
I completely agree with you. I think that, of course, objects have context, like you said, Taylor. I think viewers are trapped in the history of art sometimes. And, the history of painting, the history of sculpture. The thing for me about objects is that they're performative in a certain way. There is an original context. When I use them, I want to transform the context. I want to broaden the scope of what they mean. So I think they can both be, like you said, Taylor, it's the object in itself that has a context and becomes the art. Mm-hmm. Or you can take the object, collaborate with the original maker, collaborate with the object, and then it becomes something totally different. And that's the magic for me. If art is all communication, then the object becomes a player within the scope of the work for me.
I think that's a really elegant way of putting it. And, this is something that's been in the back of my mind since we really kind of were looking at this topic, is why is it, though, that somehow or another there becomes this definition between certain mediums or certain materials as whether or not they're art, be it a found object. There's these classifications that we get into, that's craft versus art making. And what is that, is it an easy definition? Like, what is the intent of the object? Is it meant to be used outside of the kind of realm of art, or is it purely meant for that engagement of art? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because part of me secretly hates when everything is called an artistic, or that like you're a sandwich artist. No, you're not an artist. You're making a sandwich. Yes, you did it well. Right? That doesn't mean it's artwork. I'm sorry, Subway. And I just totally alienated a whole group of listeners.
Don't talk about Subway, man. That's a bad move.
That's the end of my career right there. Where do we start talking about medium in that? Where do you guys see that? How do we deconstruct this idea of, what is a painting? Because I look at both of your guys' work as paintings. Mm-hmm. Suchitra and I were speaking about this pre-show, that there's this almost idea of time that is put into the piece, and that's what makes it considered art. Like, you have to have the Michelangelo doing the Sistine Chapel that took half of his life and all this man hours, and was this this struggle, versus finding an object that's already made, that already has that communication for you. It wasn't something that you created. And so I guess with that, it's, how do you know personally when you're making art?
I would say for me, like to back up to a second where you were talking about kind of the categorizations of the different mediums and stuff, and like sculpture and painting and photography and all those things. And I think that type of categorization is extremely limiting to an artist to even think inside of that box. If you're like thinking, like labeling, calling yourself a painter while making paintings kind of restricts you to making paintings, because you're thinking in the language of painting and you're making like painterly decisions and you're using paint to make paintings. There's a lot of available things that can happen in your work when you start to not really care what what box it's supposed to fit in. To just let go of that. And for me, that was helpful, is to like let go of trying to call myself a painter or a sculptor, or even to use even art words in my head, like the word object, because it's such a like, what is art? What is object? And like you're allowed to just call it a thing. I had this great teacher and was like, stop using all that language. Just, it's a thing. Put the thing over there. Put it on the floor. Put it on the wall. Do you like the thing? She's just great. She was this great sculpture professor named Carol Garman that I had, and she was like hugely influential in my painting, and that's probably why my paintings are really super physical, because she was a big influence on me. She was constantly telling me to pay attention to like the thingness of a thing, and then walk away and not really tell you what she means. Like, think about the thingness of a thing, and then like just disappear like this like Jedi. Yeah, that had a big influence on me, as to like kind of remove this type of lexicon, like these boxes that you're supposed to put things in, or at least maybe make an attempt to. It was helpful.
I feel like this professor of yours is my new spirit animal.
Yeah.
I think that's such a freeing way of looking at practice. And I think you made a really interesting point there, like about boxing yourself in as like a painter or a sculptor, or kind of creating these definitions, because I see this all the time when somebody who, their normal practice is painting, and then they try to make an object, they try to make a sculpture, and they look at it from a very different point, and it doesn't work. It's like they're intentionally thinking about this as some separate thing from their normal art practice, that it needs to be this different thing. And that I've never seen in Suchitra's work. Suchitra has this fearless transition between all of her art making practice, whether it's on the wall, whether it's on the floor, whether it's video, whether it's, more traditional kind of painting or technique. And that's one thing that I just so admire. It has this line of aesthetic and other stuff in it, but there's not, I don't think, a clear definition of if it's a painting versus a sculpture. Or does that resonate at all, Suchitra?
Oh, totally. I was thinking about this idea of thing that you mentioned, Taylor. I recently was putting words describing a recent work of mine, and I didn't know what this object was, so I said brush thing. And it's the idea is that, for a long time, I considered myself a painter. And this is post-grad school, in grad school, and then post. And I didn't feel for a long time that I was really in the work, feeling the work, being intuitive in the way that I wanted to be. I think that while I was in that space of, being a painter, I didn't really challenge myself in the same way that I do now. So about 5 years ago, I just eliminated that definition, started to work with whatever I wanted to work with, combining and reconciling all kinds of different materials. And it feels so free. Mm-hmm. And I think my work is like 100 times better than it used to be, because I'm allowing myself that freedom. And I feel as though I don't have hierarchies, right, between found objects, made objects. I'm really excited about the interaction of all those things. And it's not even a question anymore. But I feel like, back to your point, Doug, about how the audience, how the viewer accepts that work is a totally other story, right? Because sure, if you're in the art world with a capital A, people are, open to everything. When you're not as trained, or you aren't around art with a contemporary art with capital C or whatever, I think it's a lot harder, because like you said, there's that sense of time, that sense of well, you're trained in this thing and then you spend a year on this thing and it becomes this amazing thing. Well, I honestly feel that the magic and the history of the objects that you combine and use sometimes surpass anything that I could do anyway with one medium. So it's like the combination of mediums become the alchemy, if you will, becomes the sort of exciting moment.
And it feels, oh, go ahead, Taylor.
One thing I wanted to say about the idea of how important it is to pay attention to the words you're using, even that you're not speaking, that you're just saying in your mind. Sometimes I think maybe it's interesting to look under the hood of an artist that has like a lot of like very academic titles to things, and like before something was really actually titled, to go and like look at what when they were saving it on Photoshop and it was, whatever .jpeg, whatever they name that when they're like in the studio before it's like formalized and like art, sometimes it's blue stuff with cloud shape .jpeg, and then later on that gets cleaned up into something it's like, some lofty sounding thing. I think a lot of artists actually think like that, but they try to camouflage that. They try to put this blanket over that that's like, now look how intellectual this is. And maybe some of that's fun to do, to like intentionally camouflage all of that. But anyway, that was just a fleeting thought that I had about language.
I was going to respond to that in two parts because on one level, I completely agree with you. I think, there is a sort of, to me, the idea of being academic is trying to squish your work into one particular narrative. That's what, to me, being academic is. The titles, I would disagree because for me, they're just fun. They just become another form of poetry or something, something magical. And sometimes for me, they don't necessarily even relate to the work. It's just fun. It's just fun for me to put words together the way I put.
We think very much
together.
Alike in that regard.
Yeah.
It's really interesting kind of hearing how when you guys are starting to talk about the objects and what they mean in your work, it's also kind of acknowledging that there is this hierarchy that you've been taught in some way. Like you both kind of alluded that you've heard it in this other way. You've heard that, the kind of the same idea that, people look at painting maybe differently than they would a hamburger, right?
Sure.
And so have you had any kind of personal challenges, institutionally or with somebody kind of approaching your work, where you've had to like specifically kind of name why you're using this medium or why you're using this materials?
Well, for me, I've had people ask me, because I use found fiber, found needle points, things like that sometimes, why didn't you make the needle point, and so I always have this, kind of response that my work is about conversations, right? It's about dialogue and collaborations. Me using something that's found is just part of that conversation. I think this harkens back actually, Doug, to your idea or what we were talking about regarding time, and I think there's this idea that it's a more traditional sense of that the artist has control over every part of the artistic practice. But to me, when you allow in all these surprises and all of these sort of uncontrollable moments because you're using things that somebody else made or something was, somebody else crafted, that's more exciting for me. But I think for the viewer, it's a hard thing to take. Maybe, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not concerned with like the amount of effort that needs to be applied to like, the color red in your painting. Oh, did you make that? Okay. And like, I run into stuff like questions that people have about like in about the last year and a half, I've been using a lot of cardboard in paintings or paintings that are entirely cardboard. And in most cases, in most of my work, I actually do pay attention to like making sure things are extremely structurally sound and archival and all this kind of stuff. And I really care about that, that something lasts. And But at the same time, I don't think that when somebody is questioning the use of cardboard or something that has like acid in it or lignin or however you say it, that should be some kind of barrier to stop you from like exploring that material and to its fullest extent, regardless if it only lasts 100 years or whatever. This might sound dumb, but I took this this astronomy class one time in college, and it was I had to take it so that it counted as math, but you didn't have to do any math, and it counted as like your math credit. In that class, it was like this conversation about scale, constantly about the size, your size, like in the universe, and all this kind of stuff, and like the scale of time that we're dealing with, and where we are in like the age of the sun, and like all this stuff, like this grandiose idea, right? And it really started to loosen my thinking up about materials, and I was like, wait. So the sun's gonna like explode one day and like explode the earth and everything around it. It's just gonna be like toast, like all of it's gonna go away. And so I was like, nothing's archival. Like the granite isn't archival or whatever, like, I don't know. I stopped caring about it, and I decided to just completely see how material behaves rather than be concerned with whether it's gonna last 250 years. Like I'm so important. There's going to be somebody cooler than me way after I'm gone.
And as a dealer, we get those questions all the time about archivability, and there's and that's really a question as far as and it's really typically not people who I think are like really planning on donating it to a museum or like I don't know why they really kind of bring that up, to be honest. Right. Because it's maybe something that, again, we've been kind of programmed to look at in certain ways. I know there was a book that I read kind of back in college that I found at a thrift store that was is your contemporary art more temporary than you think? And it certainly talks about archivability and types of materials and how to approach that. But I agree that I think there's a much bigger conversation around materiality that's, who cares about how long it's going to last at some point too? And is that the point of art, to last forever? Or is it more of this moment? Stuff like Buddhist mandalas or any kind of earthworks or any kind of other things that are meant to be contemplative but momentary. When we come back from a short little break here, I think we're going to continue to go a little bit deeper with, maybe not end of time sun explosion deeper, but maybe, like a art podcast version of such. One question that's been kind of circulating throughout my mind during our conversation is I really need to know what the name of your guys' last pieces were.
The last piece I made was just a couple of days ago, and it's a big obtusely shaped painting. Looks like this.
They can't see you, thing. Taylor.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
This is radio, Taylor.
Whatever. So it's this pizza shaped painting. Like a stretcher that I built that's shaped like this, like terrible shape, but structurally sound. And it's titled Fake Pizza. That's the title, tentatively. It's just Fake Pizza. And it's cardboard, or sorry, it's a charcoal on canvas. That's it. It's just a drawing. Yeah.
So Taylor's going to mock my title. I'm feeling it right now.
No.
But it was... I've never seen a shooting star, but I've felt the love of 1,000 years. And the work was made of, it had fiber, fabric, different kinds of fabric, embroidery thread, acrylic paint, a brush thing. That's the brush thing was from that work. And yeah, pretty much that was that work.
I'm not gonna make fun of your title. It's a good title.
The reason why I think I wanted to ask, to kind of get an idea of what you guys are working on in the studio is because I think it's really important that we're looking at this idea of expanding what constitutes kind of art. And I think it's really interesting that we're talking about fake pizza and then kind of an esoteric idea around materials as well. Why is it important that we are still having this conversation and expanding even upon it? How does that kind of shape what your guys' thoughts are around the importance of art? Is art important? I don't know.
Why, yes, Doug, art is important. I think there's this idea of, there's a great irony actually, because if you use all kinds of weird objects, the general audience is suspicious in a certain way, right? But if you open art to be inclusive of all objects, then a lot more people can make it, right? I think that widening the scope of what the possibilities are via materials makes it more accessible in some ways. And I think that's important, or an important aspect of it, of making with all these different mediums and strange findings. So
for me, like in the question about like the importance of art or something as broad as that, like for me, making art, coming to art, it changed the entire course of my life. And at 35 years old, it like radically changed my thinking, changed my politics. It changed everything about me. So before I made art, I was in the military I was in the Marines for about a decade. I was in the wars and all that stuff. And I got out of the military and I felt kind of lost. Like I didn't know what to do with my life after that. And I worked in the business world for a bit, and that was fun for a while, but it just didn't feel like what I was doing was authentic. There was something missing. And I had the GI Bill, which paid for my college, and they don't care like what you go to college for. And so I eventually started taking art classes in college. The second I walked into the building, I was like, this is like heaven. Like there's something about this place, the way it smells, the way all the kids look. It's like a totally different weird subculture in there that I had discovered. And I was like, man, you can like, this is college still? Like you get a degree for this? And it was so much fun. But it really, to be, I guess, good at it or successful at making art in the estimation of other people, you have to be really honest with yourself and with other people. You have to be really, really authentic. I think it's very important. And I guess just through the process of making art, it kind of stripped away this thing that had been built on top of me, like with militarism and all this stuff, right? That I needed for survival, and like all that kind of stuff kind of fell away from me, and it cut me down to like the core of who I was before I was like an 18-year-old kid, like where you're just kind of playing with stuff and having fun like a child, like with materials. And it brought me back to that. Taught me this is who you really are. And for me, that's its importance to me.
I love that you're speaking in these terms of art as like a truth.
Sure.
One thing that we've maybe separated in some idea is the idea of the object versus that truth. So why is it so difficult for people to accept this kind of concept that, an artist is really this master of ideas versus of a medium? I think that kind of comes into this idea of what we were talking about with, how much time you're working on a particular thing, if something's ready-made or if it's something that you're, laboriously working on. How do we kind of shift the subject of our conversation around art from the produced materials to kind of the ideas within that? When did it become so much about mastery of technique versus, mastery of concept?
I think that's something I think about a lot, because so much of my work, can be, quickly hewn or and so much of it is about idea. It's so much about the conceptual framework and also the kind of magic of putting these things together. And a lot of it is uncontrolled. And I think that when one works with a lot of mediums and all these objects, you have to trust a lot to intuition. And intuition is a hard thing for people to take, even in the art community, in the art world, let's say the larger art world, there's a sense of, a close knit relationship between a narrative that you created for yourself or a framework and the objects and the artwork that you make. And when you start trusting intuition, there's endless possibilities, but I think it's harder for people to trust that. It's a harder thing for people to trust, even if you as the artist trusts it. And I think that's part of the, I guess, suspicion of these really, radically different objects or using them.
That's suspicion, though. I think instead of trying to get rid of it, though, that sometimes that's suspicion that people have about the things that aren't, because you have the weight of the Mona Lisa and the sculpture of David, all weighing down on top of people. That's what art is, right? But the suspicion of things that deviate outside of those traditional forms or objects or whatever is kind of maybe what gives it its strength. I want people to be suspicious of it. I want people to have a problem with it. That makes it fun. If everything was so accepted, it wouldn't be fun anymore. It wouldn't feel like one of the most fun things about making art, and especially if you can figure out some way to, even if you can make $1 from it, one of the fun things about that is that sometimes it feels or actually no, almost all of the time, it feels like I robbed a bank and nobody knew that I was nobody knows that I robbed this bank. I got, wow. It's this magic trick, and it's so much fun. Even if you just drew a drawing and it's $6 to somebody in a park and you'd spend 30 seconds doing it. It's super fun. That's a fun thing. And often that's also criticized too, for you to even be thinking about money is oh no, that's dangerous. And anyway, so yeah, I think the suspicion is something I wouldn't want to get rid of. It's kind of like the aorta of really good ideas, and
it starts to get into the theater of it, right? We don't necessarily want everybody to know how the sausage is made, when within the art world. There's kind of part of us wants to keep that magic, right, to ourselves. We know how to do this. There is a secret around it, and maybe you should be a little suspicious of it. So then does it become important for us to educate people and help them kind of expand what their concept is of art, or is it good that they have this sort of limited concept that then we can play with it around the fringes?
I agree with Taylor. The suspicion that I was talking about is healthy. I think all of this is ultimately about taking risks. Being an artist is about taking risks. And if you're willing to push the boundaries in whatever way you can, whether it be, about the commodification of your work or the materiality of your work, whatever it is, the ideas, I think that's what makes it exciting and interesting, right? And so, sometimes when you make work with, let's say non-traditional materials, I think there is that idea. I was thinking a lot about what you said in the first half, Taylor, about the work lasting through time. For me, it's, if you're using an object that's already been around for 40 years and you take it into your fold and you make it communicate something, that object's going to last longer than you, many of those objects, and it's going to be shifted and taken or trashed or whatever. It's not about preserving something over time. It's about kind of creating a magic in a moment that you can, and holding it dear. And I think that's something that I think about anyway.
Yeah. It's a record of your interaction with stuff. And I was here, carved my name into this tree. So.
Or in some ways it's impermanent, right? The mandala that you were talking about, Doug. I think, it's that sense of not being attached.
So I feel like this is exactly why contemporary artwork is so important, is because it's a catalyst for bigger discussions. That object becomes this catalyst for us to have a conversation about anything in the world that might be really difficult for us to bring up in another way. What have you seen in your work that feels important to kind of that contemporary discussion? Like, why is contemporary art important?
I think for me, like, I use the process or like the action of, like, making art. I use it as a way sometimes to like understand how it is that I think. And so like by making a thing, you understand yourself more. Like, why do I like this? And it's kind of like carving into for me, it's like carving into something to figure out why you think something is funny. Like, it's a way of analyzing the structure in your mind that is like, okay, well, what makes that really funny to you?
For me, the Suchitra, I think the question I'm trying to get at is when we're kind of redefining what art looks like to ourselves, and because we're trying to figure out how other people are engaging with it, is that really an important way of even thinking about art? Should that be part of our consideration when we're approaching art?
Like how the viewer will actually understand or take what they will take away from the art?
Yeah, that, or what the importance is of our own, kind of creation of that art. Like, are we creating a conversation just by making it, or do we consciously have to be engaging with that conversation in order for it to come to life? I know that doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
When I said intuition, one thought, one vision leads to another, thought or vision. And the combination of all those visions becomes the ultimate thing, right? The thing that's finished or complete or the art. It's a hard question. I don't think anymore about that question. I just learn about both myself and the world and process everything through art, through making, right? And so, someone asked me once if I ever have a block. Like, do I have blocks, art blocks? And I don't, because, making the art helps me to work through personal things as well, right? For a long time, I couldn't make any art. I was ill. I couldn't make anything. And most of my life. So for the last 5 years, I've basically been working through every single idea that I've ever had in my entire life and trying to get it all out, before I can't do it again. So yes, art is important as a cultural tool, marker, means of communication, on some level, but it's also important for people who are visual, for people who think visually, for us personally to work through our ideas. Where I'm not a writer. I'm not going to communicate via writing. I'm going to communicate via art. And I don't know. It's important for the artist and the viewer and society, I guess.
But sometimes it can be like, from the viewer's perspective, that art, the utility for them can just be for them to be confronted with a question like, why don't I like this? Or why do I like this? Like this, I shouldn't like this, but I do. And those types of questions are not really asked of people very often in everyday life, And so art is something that can pose these like really obtuse questions to people and cause them to ask themselves questions, like, why do I have a problem with this banana taped to a wall? Is it because it's too easy? Does it make me mad that it's really expensive? Is that my problem with it? And then you can dig down a few layers deeper into that, and find out what's really making you upset about this. So it's like a stick of dynamite sometimes that can explode something inside of someone. That's its utility, at least for me. Sometimes the artists arrive at those positions too, like something that's so completely absurd, like in its final form, the thing that you see in a show or something. Sometimes they arrive at them in the most obtuse manner possible, and it's like and it all makes sense. It's like genius, but in reality, a lot of times it's like I heard it the other day. I love this phrase. It was a lot of times it's somebody firing an arrow and then painting a bullseye around it. after the fact. And I was like, when I heard that, I was like, that's pretty much how I work. And or I think a lot of artists actually work like that, you know. They just kind of don't know what they're doing. Then all of a sudden this key turns and it's like, oh wait, this makes sense. And ooh, that makes me think about this and this and this and this. And then they kind of play with like the little levels and stuff on it, you know, like on a mixer board. Okay, now this makes sense, and they're going to read it like that if I want them to. Or like with me, sometimes I want to obliterate all of the obvious references to anything, like where there's not a lot of inroads to what you see. There are obvious cues to how I want you to think about it.
Also emotion, right? I mean, there's so many other ways for intellectualizing material, for thinking about material, but art allows us to emote. And I think that's what you were getting at, Taylor, with like exploding, you know, something inside someone. There aren't a lot of means in our current day society where we get to do that. And I think that is the function of art. There's so many other ways you can communicate, but art allows that kind of core gut emotive thing to happen.
Right.
You guys just like defined that so beautifully. We started out with this amazingly immense esoteric question that I feel like we actually kind of zeroed in on an answer. You know, like it's this invitation to question. It's an invitation to have some kind of deeper understanding of yourself or of what emotions might come up. It's this invitation is what art is. Taylor White, thank you so much for joining us. Suchitra, it's always an honor to speak with you. I really like what you guys had to say about this, so thank you so much.
Cool, yeah, thanks for having us on.
Thank you so much, Doug. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to the Artbound podcast. For more information about the guests and what we've discussed, go to artistnetwork.com/artbound. You can also find ways to connect with me and the Artbound team. We'd love to hear from you. If you've enjoyed the show, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen. Artbound is an Artist Network podcast and produced by Golden Peak Media. It's hosted by me, Doug Kacena. Our producer is Dacia Clay, with audio engineering and editing by Evan Rutherford. Director of podcasts is Jared Mayer. Executive producer for Artist Network is Scott Meyer. Trisha Waddell is the director of content. Sarah Van Patter handles all our marketing, and Vanessa Childers does all things digital. If you'd like more information on sponsoring or advertising on Artbound, go to goldenpeakmedia.com. I'm Doug Kacena. Until next time.